From misty forests to thunder-swept seas they emerged, warriors who shaped Europe's destiny. The Germanic tribes, Goths, Franks, Saxons, and Vandals, were not merely Rome's destroyers, but its inheritors. With iron blades and ancient oaths, they carved kingdoms from empire's corpse. While Roman walls crumbled, their customs endured. Assembly-born law, warrior loyalty, and fierce independence. First as raiders, then settlers, finally as kings crowned by Christ, they transformed from outsiders to architects. Though their gods now sleep beneath cathedral stones, their legacy lives in every parliament, court, and market, from London to Vienna. Their blood-soaked migration became Europe's foundation, a journey from tribal fires to medieval thrones. When neither iron, nor rule, nor border yet existed, the forest was all there was. Endless and deep, it rolled over the land from the North Sea to the Baltic, from Jutland to the valleys that would one day bear the name of Germany. Mists drifted between the birches, and the lakes mirrored skies that seldom cleared. Here, amid the cold fertility of the north, the ancestors of the Germanic peoples took root. The people of the funnel beaker and corded ware cultures left behind no chronicles, only the eloquence of earth and bone. Their clay vessels, shaped like inverted bells, still hold the impressions of fingers that vanished 3,000 years ago. They lived by the rhythm of the seasons, tilling patches of thin soil and herding cattle through the marshy plains. Flint and amber were their wealth, drawn from coasts where gulls screamed and the wind cut like iron. Bronze, a metal that shone like trapped sunlight, reached them through far-off trade, its presence proof that the north was never truly isolated, only guarded by its weather and its silence. Around 1300 BC, the subboreal climate shift altered everything. Winters grew harsher, summers shorter, harvests uncertain. Lakes swelled and forests advanced where meadows had once been. Families abandoned exhausted fields and drifted toward higher ground, pushing slowly from the Baltic lowlands into southern Scandinavia. In their migration lay the first faint stirring of identity. Not yet a people, but kin bound by language, by memory, and by the shared endurance of cold. They built small settlements on ridges of dry soil, longhouses that faced the wind like ships. Each was both dwelling and fortress, timber walls packed with clay, roofs thatched so low the snow could not enter. Inside, men and animals slept under the same smoky rafters. The hearth marked the tribe's center. Its smoke escaped through a narrow hole in the roof, the wind-eye, ancestor of the word window. In that mingling of breath and smoke, the first households of the north found their shape. Beyond the settlement stretched a landscape both merciful and cruel. Rivers ran black and slow beneath the trees, and in their bends the people built wooden walkways over the bogs. They fished for pike and perch, gathered berries in the thickets, and cut peat for fuel. Yet the same waters that gave life also claimed it. When judgment or devotion demanded sacrifice, they turned again to the bog. The peat preserved everything. The twisted roots of oaks, the haft of a spear, the body of a man offered to unseen gods. Centuries later, when the spades of farmers cut through the moors, these bog bodies surfaced again, men with slit throats, women strangled with plaited cords, their faces still tender beneath the weight of centuries. Their hair had turned red in the acid soil, their limbs folded in ritual repose. Some bore marks of punishment, others the careful arrangement of ceremony. The forest had kept their stories better than parchment ever could. Archaeologists would call them victims. Their own kin may have called them gifts. Through them, we glimpse the earliest lore of the Germanic world. that justice and faith were not separate things, but two edges of the same blade. Such rites reveal a people who lived in reverence of the natural world. The sky itself was a god, and thunder the sign of his approval or anger. The sun was a golden wheel that rolled across the heavens, mirrored in the solar discs found buried beside chiefs and warriors. Cattle skulls lined the doorways of the dead, offerings to the unseen powers of fertility and storm. The ancestors were ever present, not as ghosts, but as guardians watching from the barrows. To offend them was to imperil the harvest, the hunt, and the tribe's honor. Though their world seemed static, it pulsed with connection. Traders came north along the amber routes from the Danube and the Elbe, carrying bronze blades, glass beads, and stories of distant lands where the sun was hotter and men built cities of stone. In return, the northerners sent what the earth offered: amber, furs, and hardy slaves taken in raids. Contact bred curiosity, and with curiosity came the slow shaping of a Proto-Germanic tongue, a language born of mingled roots, hardened by wind and consonant like the clack of axes on wood. It was a speech fit for cold mornings and solemn vows, and it would one day become the voice of half a continent. Yet life remained fragile. Hunger stalked every winter, and kinship was the only protection. The clan was the measure of existence, a circle of families ruled by the oldest man, his word binding as law. To be cast out was a living death. Honor was survival, and survival was shared labor. Women brewed grain beer in clay pots and wove coarse wool into cloaks. Men cleared the forest edge, their bronze sickles gleaming faintly in the weak sun. Children learned early to endure. The frostbite, the silence, the distance between hearths. In that endurance lay the temperament of a people who would never bow easily to kings or conquerors. At the heart of each community stood a sacred place, sometimes a grove where no axe was lifted, sometimes a wooden post carved with the semblance of a face. Offerings of food, animals, or weapons were laid there when the harvest failed or a chieftain died. These pole gods watched over the tribe, their names now lost, but their forms familiar. The first sketches of deities who would later bear the names of Odin, Thor, and Freya. Around the fires, tales were spoken of spirits that walked the marshes, of the world's creation from ice and flame. Myth was not invention, but memory arranged into story, a way to make sense of the endless dark. As centuries passed, the boundaries between tribes began to blur. Across the Jutland Peninsula and the North German plain, small communities merged, shared customs, and occasionally clashed. Skirmishes over grazing land hardened into the habit of war. Victory brought prestige. Defeat meant absorption. The chieftain who could lead in battle became the father of many clans, and his followers swore loyalty in exchange for spoils. Thus the seeds of hierarchy were sown amid equality, a paradox that would define Germanic society forever. Trade followed conquest. From the Baltic shores came amber and whalebone. From the south, ornaments of bronze and gold. The longhouses of the wealthy grew larger, their stables filled with cattle and horses. With wealth came differentiation, the birth of nobles and the first slaves. Yet even among the prosperous, there was no permanence. The forest reclaimed what men abandoned, and the lake swallowed their dead with indifference. Still, something enduring was forming, a sense of kinship beyond clan, an intuition of shared origin. Their speech, their rituals, their funerary rites began to echo one another across vast distances. Where once there had been many tongues, now there was one family of sound, rough, guttural, resolute. This was the language that would become the matrix of Proto-Germanic, carrying within it the cadence of the north itself. Toward the end of this age, the bronze that had once been sacred grew scarce. Iron, darker and harder, began to appear in burial sites and workshops. The change was quiet but irreversible. With iron came sharper blades, stronger plows, and a new confidence in human hands. The tribes were ready to expand beyond their forests, though they did not yet know it. The last of the old bog's sacrifices belonged to this twilight. In one, a young man lies face down in the peat, his throat cleanly cut, his body carefully placed beside a broken sword. Perhaps he was a slave, perhaps a chosen offering, perhaps he was both. Around him, the reeds whisper as the wind passes, the same wind that once filled the sails of distant traders, the same that will one day carry the war cries of the Cimbri, the Teutones, and the Goths. When the sun sank behind the pines and the northern lights rippled like banners across the sky, these early tribes gathered around their fires and spoke of ancestors who had crossed the ice to find this land. They believed the past was a living thing that walked beside them, whispering counsel through the trees. In time, those whispers would grow into legend, and legend into history. For now, the world was only forest and firelight, bronze and blood, and the silence of gods who listened from the bog. And in that silence, the story of the Germanic peoples began. The centuries after the Bronze Age turned slowly, like the wheel of a sun chariot half buried in the peat. The old gleam of bronze dulled beneath the soot of new forges, and out of that darkness came iron, harder, common, democratic. Iron reshaped more than tools. It reshaped power. The northern peoples, scattered across Jutland, southern Scandinavia, and the plains of the Elbe, entered an age of strength and story, when memory began to dress itself in myth. It was an age without writing, but not without history. The words lived in the mouths of singers who carried them from hearth to hearth. Every victory, every betrayal, every haunting omen became a song. Through these songs, the ancestors ceased to be merely remembered. They became divine. Woden, the wanderer and cunning god, was once a man whose wisdom outlived his flesh. Thor, breaker of frost and thunder, may have been a warrior whose hammer of oak and stone had shattered enemies long forgotten. In the retelling, their deeds grew taller than truth, and their voices thundered across the generations until they became the gods themselves. Around the fires, chieftains listened as skalds chanted the stories of first kings and founders. The sagas did more than entertain. They bound the tribes together. In those recitations, time blurred. The past was never gone, only waiting to be spoken again. When a warrior raised his spear beneath the storm, he was not merely fighting for his clan. He was reenacting the battles of Woden and Thor, keeping the world from sliding back into chaos. By 500 BC, the first recognizable Germanic societies had formed from the ashes of the Bronze Age cultures. Archaeologists would later give them names: Jastorf, Przeworsk, Harpstedt. But to the people themselves, they were simply folk. Each tribe was a circle of kin, bound by oaths and blood, ruled by assemblies of free men called things. Here, decisions were made under open skies. Justice was spoken aloud, and every man's voice carried the weight of his sword arm. Chiefs ruled not by decree, but by persuasion, by the strength of their lineage and their ability to lead in war. The forest still hemmed them in, but they had begun to look outward. The rivers that once served as boundaries became roads. Rafts and shallow draft boats carried traders southward toward the Celts of Gaul and Bohemia. From these meetings came iron blades, salt, and coloured glass, but also new dangers. The Celts were older, richer, and practiced in war. The first Germanic warriors who faced them learned that courage alone was not enough. They began to adopt the round shields, chainmail, and swords of their neighbors, even as they swore they would never live by foreign ways. Conflict soon followed trade. Small bands of raiders crossed into Celtic lands, seeking plunder or pasture. Some stayed and mingled, taking Celtic wives, learning their crafts and gods. Others returned north with tales of lands where the earth was softer, the winters mild, and the chiefs fat from feasting. These stories drifted from valley to valley, fusing with memory, and in time they became the first migration myths, dreams of a promised land beyond the rivers. Each generation embellished the tales. Some said their ancestors had come from a golden homeland far to the east, where the sun rose over endless plains. Others claimed descent from divine twins who tamed the storm. The truth mattered less than the telling. These were not lies, but necessary illusions, scaffolds upon which identity could grow. A people without cities or writing built themselves from stories instead. By 300 BC, the northern tribes had multiplied and spread like the branches of an oak. Some pushed west toward the North Sea. Others drifted south into the plains between the Elbe and the Rhine. The old divisions between coastal and inland peoples blurred as alliances formed and broke. Honor became currency, war the means of proving it. In every tribe, a new social order took root. The comitatus, a circle of sworn companions bound to their lord by loyalty unto death. A chieftain's worth was measured not only by his victories, but by the number of warriors who would follow him into fire. He rewarded them with gold, plunder, and feasts, and they repaid him with faith and ferocity. These warbands became the nuclei of kingdoms yet unborn, the seed of the heroic ideal that would echo in every later age, from the halls of the Franks to the sagas of the Norse. The chieftain's hall stood at the center of this world, built of heavy timber, roofed with reeds. Its smoky interior glowed with lamplight and mead. Here the warriors feasted, and the skald recited lineages that reached back to gods. Bones cracked in the fire, dogs gnawed at scraps. The noise of laughter rose against the storm. Outside, the world was uncertain, floods, famines, raids. But within the hall there was order, the fragile order of courage and song. Religion, too, had begun to evolve from its ancestral simplicity. The faceless pole gods of the bogs acquired names and stories. Sacrifices were still made in sacred groves, but now they were accompanied by chants that invoked distinct powers. The Sky Father who rode the winds, the Thunderbringer who guarded the harvest, the Mother of the Earth whose tears were rain. These deities were not abstract. They lived in the thunder, the hearth, the blade. To slay an enemy was to please them. To dishonor one's kin was to offend them. The things, those tribal assemblies, reflected this same duality of violence and sanctity. Warriors gathered on sacred ground, weapons laid aside, to settle disputes and declare war. Decisions were confirmed by the clashing of spears against shields, a chorus of iron that turned debate into ritual. In such meetings, one sees the faint outlines of later law, the reverence for oath and witness, the belief that justice must be public, visible, and bound by words as strong as steel. From the edges of this world came whispers of great movements to the south. The Celts were not alone. Beyond them lay lands ruled by men who called themselves Romans, who were said to build walls that reached the clouds and to march with thunder beneath their feet. The northern tribes had never seen these conquerors, but their legends began to account for them. The coming of such strangers was woven into prophecy, the warning that the age of heroes would end when men of stone appeared. And yet, before that reckoning, there was splendor. In this late Iron Age, the North flourished in its own austere way. Villages multiplied along riverbanks, cattle herds thickened, and long-distance trade grew. Iron knives replaced bronze ornaments. Weapons became heirlooms passed from father to son. Jewelry of silver and amber adorned women's necks, proof of the distance their men could travel and return alive. Burial mounds rose over the fields, round, solemn, facing the rising sun. The dead were sent to the next world with their tools, weapons, and drinking horns. Some graves contained both man and horse, bound together for eternity, a partnership forged in war. These rites preserved the conviction that life and death were one unbroken journey, that the departed still fought and feasted in a realm mirroring their own. In the imagination of the living, the afterlife was not a paradise, but a hall of echoes. There, the brave rejoined their ancestors. The coward wandered in fog. The skalds claimed to have seen it in dreams, a great hall roofed in gold, where Woden sat enthroned, receiving the slain. This vision of valor redeemed suffering, making every battle a holy act, every death a passage toward glory. So the myths hardened into purpose. The young learned early that fame outlasted flesh, that the only immortality lay in the memory of others. A warrior's name, spoken around the hearth, was his true monument. In this belief lay the moral code of the tribes, the germ of the later heroic ethos that would shape Europe's knights and kings. By the 1st century BC, their world was ready to touch history. The tales had given them identity. The iron had given them strength. Their migrations toward the south gathered pace, driven by hunger, ambition, and curiosity. To the Romans, who would soon meet them, they seemed a tide of savages pouring from the mist. To themselves, they were a chosen people, reclaiming the lands their gods had promised in story. Across the forests, the songs of the skalds carried one refrain. The gods had once walked among men, and their descendants still bore their fire. The age of heroes was not yet past, it was only beginning. In the distance, beyond the forests and the Rhine, the shadow of Rome was already lengthening. When the first Roman scouts reached the Rhine, they found not an empire to conquer, but a mirror to their own beginnings. Beyond the dark river stretched a land of forest and mist, inhabited by tribes whose names shifted like the weather. Cimbri, Teutones, Ambrones, Suebi, and others yet unrecorded. The Romans called them all Germani, a word that meant nothing to those it named. To the people of the north, identity was not a label, but a lineage sung by the hearthfire. The confrontation began as rumour. Traders from Gaul spoke of vast movements in the far north, villages abandoning their homes, families on wagons, herds driven across the rivers. The old climate had changed again. Floods ruined the fields of Jutland, and famine followed. Around 120 BC, entire communities of Cimbri and Teutones gathered their belongings and set forth in search of new land. It was not invasion, but migration, slow and desperate, a human tide that would soon engulf half of Europe. At first, the Celts resisted. The newcomers drove through their territories like storm fronts, defeating them with a ferocity that astonished even seasoned warriors. Then they crossed the Danube and entered the Roman sphere. In 113 BC, near Neraea, Roman legions met the migrants in battle and broke. For the first time, Rome learned what it meant to face a people who fought not for conquest, but for survival. The victors did not linger. They moved westward through Gaul, joined by other wandering tribes, Ambrones, Tigurini, Toigani, until their campfires stretched from the Alps to the Atlantic. Children were born on the move. Old men died by the roadside. Their wagons, circle after circle, became moving villages guarded by warriors who fought barefoot and painted. When the Romans faced them again at Arausio in 105 BC, disaster followed. 80,000 legionaries were cut down and their standards taken. The fields of southern Gaul were littered with Roman dead, their bodies stripped by men who knew no mercy and sought none. Panic swept Italy. For a generation, the Roman Republic had imagined itself the master of the known world. Now the north seemed to pour out its fury upon them. It took Gaius Marius, the grim reformer, to turn the tide. At Aix-en-Provence and later at Vercellae, his reorganized legions met the migrating tribes and annihilated them. The Cimbri and Teutones were destroyed, yet their legend endured. In Roman memory, they became the archetype of the barbarian horde, tall, pale, inexhaustible, incapable of fear. Rome had met the Germanic world, and both were changed by the encounter. The Romans learned to fortify their frontiers. The tribes learned that an empire could bleed. Between them stretched the Rhine, a line of geography soon hardened into mythology. South of it lay civilization. North, the wilderness, where freedom and death walked hand in hand. But the Rhine was not a wall. It was a mirror. Across its waters, new powers rose. Among them stood the Suebi, restless and ambitious, their hair knotted high in the style that would later bear their name. Under Ariovistus, they forged a confederation, stretching from the Elbe to the Vosges, absorbing weaker tribes and driving the Celts before them. Their gatherings were vast, their loyalty bound not by law, but by the charisma of their war leader. Ariovistus was no savage. He understood diplomacy as well as the sword. Around 70 BC, he entered into treaties with the Roman governors of Gaul, even receiving recognition from the Senate as amicus populi Romani, friend of the Roman people. For a moment, it seemed that the two worlds might coexist, yet friendship with Rome was a serpent's embrace. As Ariovistus pressed farther into Gaul, his ambitions threatened the balance that Julius Caesar sought to impose. In 58 BC, the two leaders met in words before they met in battle. Caesar demanded that the Suebi withdraw east of the Rhine. Ariovistus replied that the river was no man's to command. Both claimed divine sanction. Both understood that compromise was weakness. When the fighting came, it was swift and brutal. The disciplined legions broke the Germanic wedge formations, and Ariovistus barely escaped across the river with his life. His confederation dissolved, but his defiance lingered like smoke. Caesar's victory made him master of Gaul, yet he never crossed the Rhine to stay. He sent expeditions, demonstrations of might, but withdrew each time, leaving behind stories of forests so vast that daylight itself grew dim. In his commentaries, he described the Germans as savage yet pure, uncorrupted by luxury, devoted to liberty and war. They were, he admitted, dangerous precisely because they feared nothing but dishonor. His words, meant as warning, became admiration in disguise. To the Romans, these people were both nightmare and fascination. Writers imagined them as reflections of Rome's own forgotten virtue, unsoftened by wealth, untamed by city life, free of decadence. The philosopher would praise their courage even as the general planned their destruction. The contrast was irresistible. On one side, marble and law. On the other, mud and valor. For the tribes themselves, Rome was less a threat than a horizon. The goods that filtered north, coins, glassware, weapons, were tokens of a glittering, alien world. Traders brought news of cities where stone walls rose higher than trees and soldiers marched in iron discipline. The younger warriors listened and dreamed not of surrender but of challenge. Their songs began to speak of a southern power that believed itself eternal. Eternity, they sang, was only another kind of arrogance. The frontier hardened. Roman forts and watchtowers appeared along the Rhine and the Danube, their fires gleaming in the night like a line of stars. Beyond them, the tribes gathered strength. The Suebi reorganized under new chiefs. The Cherusci and Chatti carved out territories in the deep woods of the Weser Valley. Skirmishes flared, then died away, but memory kept the wounds open. In these generations, the Germanic peoples began to think of themselves as distinct from their Celtic neighbors. The Roman label Germani, at first meaningless, slowly became a badge of difference. Language united them where geography divided them. Their songs now spoke of shared descent, of gods who favored the people of the north. Whether this identity grew from pride or from the pressure of an empire's gaze, no one could say. But by the time of Caesar's conquest, it was already taking form. Meanwhile, the Romans turned the Rhine into myth. Poets wrote of the river as the edge of the world, the boundary between order and chaos. To cross it was to descend into night, and yet, in that darkness, the Germanic tribes were awakening. Their society, still tribal, had begun to organize around leaders whose names echoed through the valleys. Ariovistus in the west, Maroboduus in the east, Bohemia, Segamerus among the Cherusci. They were not kings, as Rome understood the word, but chosen men, first among equals, held aloft by the loyalty of their warriors. The wars of this period left little trace except in legend. Bones sank into the soil, weapons rusted, names blurred. What survived was memory, the knowledge that the Romans could be beaten, that their gods bled like any other. The Rhine became less a barrier than a promise. One day, the song said, the forest would march south. By the end of the 1st century BC, that promise had found its champion. In the ranks of the Roman auxiliaries served a young Cheruscan named Arminius, trained in Latin, armored in Roman steel. He watched, learned, and waited. For now, the tribes bided their time beneath the empire's shadow. But shadows lengthen only before the coming of light. After Caesar's death, the Rhine stood unbroken for a generation, the narrow boundary of an uncertain peace between civilization and forest. The Romans built fortresses of stone. The tribes answered with silence and watchful patience. Behind that stillness, however, the northern world was shifting. The Suebi, under new chiefs, gathered strength. The Chatti sharpened their iron, and in the deep valleys of the Weser, a man was born who would one day break the spell of Roman invincibility. He was Arminius, son of a Cheruscan noble named Segamerus. Rome, in its confidence, had taken the young man as a hostage for his father's loyalty and educated him as one of their own. He learned their tongue, their strategies, the rhythm of their legions marching behind brass. When he returned to his people as a Roman officer, he brought more than armor and command. He brought understanding. He knew the empire's strength and its blindness. The tribes of that age were not nations, but shifting alliances of pride and fear. The Suebi, once led by Ariovistus, now roamed from the Elbe to the Main, their long hair tied in the warrior's knot that marked them as free men. The Chatti, disciplined and stern, held the wooded hills of Hesse, priding themselves on order and endurance. The Cherusci, Arminius's people, occupied the heart of the forest between the Weser and the Lippe. Though kin in tongue and custom, these tribes feuded as often as they fought together. It would take betrayal, blood, and vision to unite them even for a moment. Rome, meanwhile, sought to bring this wilderness into its system of governance. The Emperor Augustus, confident after victories in Gaul and Hispania, dispatched legions east of the Rhine to turn Germania into a province. Roads were cut through forests, forts raised at river crossings. Roman merchants followed the soldiers, bringing amphorae of wine, glassware, and silk. The young drank southern luxuries. The elders warned that such softness carried a price. By 12 B.C., Drusus, stepson of Augustus, led the first great campaigns into the German interior. His engineers built bridges that spanned entire rivers, feats of precision that awed even the enemy. The legions advanced as if the world itself could be measured and subdued, but the forest had its own laws. The paths turned to mud, the rivers swallowed rafts, and unseen enemies struck from behind trees that seemed alive with eyes. When Drusus died after a fall from his horse, the tribes whispered that the land itself had rejected the conqueror. For all their setbacks, the Romans did not retreat. They returned under Tiberius, and later under Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man sent to pacify, not destroy. Varus believed in law and administration. He sought to impose Roman order where Rome had not yet been invited. He built towns, collected taxes, judged disputes among the tribes. Some chiefs submitted, hoping for wealth or stability. Others simmered with resentment. Among them was Arminius, outwardly loyal, inwardly plotting. The year 9 AD became a wound in Roman memory. Varus marched east with 3 legions, 17, 18, and 19th, through the damp valleys near the Teutoburg forest. The rain fell for days, turning the ground to mire. The columns stretched thin along the narrow track. Then, from the mist, came the war horns. Trees shuddered as spears rained down, carts overturned, mules screamed. The Cherusci struck first, then the Chatti, then every tribe within shouting distance. For 3 days, the Romans fought and fell in chaos. Varus, realizing the trap, fell on his sword. When the storm ended, 20,000 Romans lay dead. Their eagle standards were taken as trophies, their bodies left unburied. Arminius stood amid the wreckage, his face streaked with mud and rain, and felt the forest breathe around him like a living god. Rome's shadow had broken. The empire reeled. In the marble halls of Augustus, silence followed the news. "Varus," he cried, "give me back my legions." But the legions were gone, swallowed by a wilderness that refused to be tamed. Rome withdrew to the Rhine, building massive forts and walls that marked not conquest, but containment. Germania would remain beyond, unconquered in name and spirit. For Arminius, triumph came with a curse. Unity among the tribes was fleeting. Old rivalries resurfaced. Some hailed him as liberator, others feared his ambition. The Suebi withdrew to the east, the Chatti hardened into isolation. Even the Cherusci turned inward. When the Romans returned under Germanicus, nephew of the emperor, they found not a single enemy, but a landscape fractured by its own freedom. Between 14 and 16 AD, Germanicus led a campaign of vengeance. His forces crossed the Rhine in force, burning villages, recovering the bones of Varus's dead, and burying them beneath Roman standards. He met Arminius in open battle on the plain of Edistaviso. The fight raged from dawn to dusk, a storm of arrows and shouting. Though the Romans claimed victory, they could not hold what they took. The forest closed behind them. The tribes melted away. Germanicus withdrew, his triumph celebrated in Rome but hollow in meaning. The Rhine frontier hardened again, a scar that never fully healed. Beyond war, life continued much as before. The Batavians, a Rhine tribe, became Roman allies, their horsemen serving in distant campaigns from Britain to Syria. They fought for pay and prestige, but never forgot their origins. In 69 AD, during Rome's civil wars, their leader Julius Civilis rose in rebellion. Under his banner, the Batavians destroyed Roman forts and briefly restored the old freedom of the river tribes. Though crushed, their revolt echoed the same song Arminius had sung, that no empire, however vast, could rule the forest forever. By the time Tacitus wrote his Germania in the late 1st century, the Romans no longer dreamed of conquest, but of understanding. His words are both admiration and warning. He praised the Germans for their courage, chastity, and devotion to liberty, contrasting them with a Rome softened by luxury. Yet his admiration was tinged with fear. The forest, to Tacitus, was not merely geography. It was a moral frontier, a place where virtue survived in its most savage form. Within that forest, the tribes evolved. The Suebi spread southward into what is now Swabia. The Chatti fortified their hill country and began to farm with Roman tools captured in war. The Cherusci faded, their fame swallowed by time. Others rose to take their place. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and Langobardi, each forging their own paths. Still, the story of Arminius remained, passed from tongue to tongue, a reminder that even in defeat there is defiance. The frontier itself became a world of its own. Roman traders crossed to barter for amber and furs, and Germanic youths joined Roman armies as auxiliaries. Some learned Latin, others adopted Roman gods and customs. Yet the deeper they served the empire, the more fiercely they clung to the memory of freedom. A Roman helmet might rest beside a wooden idol. A soldier might pray to Mars and still whisper to Woden before battle. Two worlds intertwined, but never merged. Across the Rhine, the empire watched and waited. Beyond its watchtowers lay 1,000 miles of trees and 1,000 tribes, none wholly friend or foe. Rome could map the roads, build the forts, and name the rivers, but it could not conquer the silence between them. And within that silence, the Germanic peoples endured, growing in number and confidence. Their warriors had stood against Rome and lived. Their assemblies still rang with the clatter of spears confirming law. Their gods still ruled the wind and thunder. They were no longer shadows on the edge of civilization. They were the North itself, wild, patient, and unbroken. Across the Rhine and the Danube, the frontier burned with uneasy light. For 2 centuries, Rome had called it the Limes, a living wall of forts, watchtowers, and patrols dividing empire from wilderness. Yet walls hold only as long as those behind them believe in their strength. Beyond that fragile boundary, the tribes were no longer scattered peoples, but rising confederations, testing the edges of Rome's reach. The Suebi of old had splintered into new identities. From their descendants came the Alemanni, all men, a name declaring alliance rather than blood. Along the lower Rhine gathered the Franks, an unruly federation of warbands bound by opportunity more than kinship. To the north, the Saxons grew bold along the seacoasts, sending their longships to raid as far as Britain's shores. Farther east, near the Vistula, the Goths gathered strength, a restless people whose migrations would one day redraw the map of Europe. These new powers were not born of peace, but of pressure. As Rome expanded its frontiers and drained the soil of tribute, the tribes were drawn together by need and chance. Chieftains who once fought over meadows now swore oaths beneath sacred oaks, their hands upon swords instead of scrolls. In those meetings, alliances were spoken into being, held by loyalty as fierce as it was temporary. Every tribe understood that unity was the rarest of weapons, and none wielded it for long. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, war returned to the Danube frontier. The Marcomannic Wars erupted in 166 AD when a coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes swept across the frozen river into Roman lands. They burned towns, besieged cities, and reached as far south as Aquileia, a threat unseen since the days of the Cimbri. The philosopher-emperor, writing meditations between battles, faced not only an enemy of men, but of time itself, a mirror of Rome's own beginnings, a people who believed hardship was strength. The campaigns dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Sometimes the legions triumphed, sometimes the tribes vanished into the forests, only to return with renewed ferocity. When Marcus Aurelius finally restored a measure of order, the cost was exhaustion. The empire's frontiers were held not by victory, but by habit. Rome remained strong on the surface, yet its foundations were trembling. Meanwhile, along the northern seas, the Saxons and Frisians turned to the water as their road. They mastered shallow draft vessels that could vanish into the fog and appear again where the coasts lay undefended. Their raids were small, swift, and merciless. Wealth flowed northward, captive labor, stolen gold, iron tools, and with it came Roman influence, uninvited but persistent. The raiders wore Roman armor, looted from battlefields. Their chiefs toasted in Roman cups. Their gods took Roman names. Each encounter blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. During the crisis of the 3rd century, that line dissolved altogether. Civil war fractured the empire. Emperors rose and fell faster than the mint could strike their coins. When Roman generals fought each other, they hired the tribes as mercenaries. Alemanni cavalry thundered across Italy in one rebellion. Gothic war bands fought for rival emperors along the Black Sea. The Germanic world became Rome's shadow army, fighting for and against the very power they sought to escape. From this chaos emerged the short-lived Gallic Empire, a breakaway realm that ruled Gaul, Britain, and parts of Germania from 260 to 274 AD. To its founders, survival meant alliance with the frontier peoples. Germanic federates guarded the Rhine, serving as both shield and threat. They learned Roman command, Roman pay, Roman arrogance, and they never forgot the empire's weaknesses. When the Gallic experiment collapsed, the tribes remained where they had fought, more entrenched than before. No longer content with skirmishes, they began to strike in waves. Alemanni forces crossed the Upper Rhine repeatedly, sacking towns and scattering garrisons. Franks swept through the lower river valley into northern Gaul, seizing cities, capturing fleets, and even reaching the Atlantic ports. The raids were not random plunder. They were reconnaissance by conquest. Each foray tested the empire's response and found it slower, softer, less certain. The Romans responded with fortifications, stone walls, signal towers, and fortified towns known as castella. Along the Danube and Rhine, the Limes Germanicus became a landscape of vigilance. Traders, settlers, and soldiers lived under constant alarm, their lives a rhythm of repair and retreat. Yet within that borderland, something unexpected grew. Markets sprang up near forts. Germanic traders sold cattle and hides in Roman silver. Intermarriage blurred ancestry. The border became less a line than a zone, a vast breathing organism where 2 civilizations fed upon one another. Cultural exchange traveled faster than conquest. Roman artisans taught the tribes metalworking. In return, the Germans offered iron and amber. Roman wine flowed north. Northern furs and slaves flowed south. Missionaries and merchants spread Latin words that mingled with the harsh syllables of the local tongue, birthing a dialect that no scholar could name. In taverns along the frontier, a centurion and a chieftain might drink from the same jug, each suspecting the other of treachery, each knowing they were bound by trade as much as by fear. Power among the tribes shifted as swiftly as rivers in flood. The Alemanni, once scattered, developed a hierarchy of kings, warlords chosen by their peers, but commanding loyalty through generosity. Their strength lay in confederation, their weakness in its volatility. The Franks perfected a looser model, several groups acting in concert, each preserving autonomy, while rallying under a single leader when danger loomed. This flexible design would one day outlast Rome itself. In the east, the Goths had begun their ascent. Migrating from the Vistula toward the Black Sea, they carved out domains that traded directly with Roman provinces. Some Gothic chieftains minted coins in imitation of Roman emperors, their names rendered in crude Latin letters. Their warriors adopted cavalry tactics learned from Sarmatian allies, blending step speed with forest endurance. To the Romans, they seemed limitless, a people who multiplied as quickly as they vanished. The empire's chroniclers saw only disaster in these movements, yet beneath the raids and rebellions, a deeper transformation was taking place. The Germanic peoples, once small and insular, were becoming cosmopolitan in war and trade. Contact with Rome taught them the art of logistics, siegecraft, and diplomacy. Each campaign that devastated a province also trained a generation of tribal leaders who thought in terms of armies, not clans. When the raids ceased, treaties often followed. Rome, weary of endless war, began to formalize the role of federati. Barbarian allies settled on imperial soil in exchange for military service. What began as emergency expedients became a pattern. By the late 3rd century, entire Germanic communities lived within the empire's borders. Farming land they nominally held as Roman subjects, but allegiance was paper-thin. These settlers were not conquered, they were invited. Their loyalty lasted only as long as the grain was plentiful and the gold arrived on time. The century ended without victory on either side. Rome still claimed its empire, though its edges bled. The tribes still claimed freedom, though their world had changed. The forests that once sheltered them were dotted with Roman watchtowers, and the Latin tongue echoed faintly in their markets. Yet the old spirit endured. Among the Alemanni, the priestesses still read omens in the smoke of sacrifice. Among the Franks, warriors still swore oaths before the gods of thunder and war. The Saxons still offered the sea its due of blood before setting sail. In their raids, they had learned Rome's strengths. In Rome's decline, they had seen its fragility. The limes that once divided civilization from wilderness now joined them in dependence. Each side could no longer exist without the other. When night fell across the frontier, the fires of Roman forts glimmered opposite the fires of Germanic villages, two worlds watching each other across a river that neither could truly cross. Between those flickering lights, the future waited. The century of raids had become the century of transformation. Along the grey shores of the Baltic, where sea and sky merged into one horizon, a restless people began to move. They called themselves Guttones, though later generations would know them as Goths. Their legends spoke of an island in the north, perhaps Sweden, from which they had sailed generations before, driven by hunger or omen. Whatever the truth, their migrations along the Vistula's course marked the beginning of a new epoch, the dawn of a people who would both inherit and undo the Roman world. Their journey southward unfolded in waves, slow as glacial melt. By the 3rd century, Gothic settlements stretched across the lands of modern Poland and into the Black Sea's northern coast. There, under a vast, treeless sky, they absorbed what they needed from every neighbor. Agriculture from the Celts, horsemanship from the Sarmatians, trade from the Greeks. Their language, once coarse, gathered polish. Their society, once tribal, began to stratify. Chiefs became kings, warriors became retainers, and lineage began to weigh more than courage. The steppe transformed them. It gave them mobility, a sense of endless possibility. It also exposed them to empires. To the south lay the Roman frontier of Dacia, now abandoned after Emperor Aurelian's withdrawal. To the east rolled the influence of the Sarmatians and the distant echo of the Huns. Between these forces, the Goths forged their own path, a civilization of motion. By 250 AD, they were already testing Rome's patience. Raiding parties rode down from the steppes into the Balkans, plundering the wealthy cities of Moesia and Thrace. They traveled with wagons that held not only warriors, but families, priests, and herds, a moving nation rather than an army. Their long hair was bound with rings of silver. Their shields were painted red and black. Their speech, the Romans said, was harsh, but musical. In battle, they shouted their kings' names until the hills trembled. Rome's weakened legions could not contain them. The empire reeled from one crisis to another. Emperors assassinated, provinces seceding, plagues raging. In 267 and 268 AD, Gothic fleets, crude but swift, sailed from the Black Sea into the Aegean. They ravaged the coasts of Greece and Asia Minor, even reaching the hallowed city of Athens. Temples burned, marble statues toppled. The Greeks, who had once written of barbarians as myth, now watched their myths walk through fire. Emperor Aurelian responded with brutal efficiency. He rallied the legions, crushed the invaders, and in his pragmatism withdrew Rome's presence north of the Danube entirely. Dacia was abandoned, its colonists resettled within safer borders. The empire could no longer defend both luxury and vastness. It chose survival. For the Goths, the retreat was invitation, not warning. They filled the vacuum left behind, planting their banners on land Rome had held for nearly 2 centuries. In these new territories, Gothic kings arose. Ermanaric, ruling in the east, forged an empire from the Black Sea to the Urals. His court shimmered with spoils, Roman silver, Persian fabrics, captive artisans. Chroniclers would later call him the King of Nations, though his rule was a patchwork of alliances, oaths, and fear. To his west, the Visigoths, or Western Goths, followed Athanaric, a leader both proud and paranoid. Between them lay the old division of steppe and forest, horse and plough, each shaping the destiny of its people. Despite their might, the Goths did not remain untouched by the world they raided. They traded with Roman merchants across the Danube, exchanged hostages, and negotiated treaties known as federa, precursors to the later foederati system. Roman diplomats arrived bearing gifts of gold and Christian scripture. Some Gothic nobles adopted Roman titles. Others mocked them as chains. Yet every exchange left a trace. Roman wine filled Gothic cups. Roman words entered Gothic prayers. It was through one such encounter that a new faith found its way north. Among the Gothic captives of earlier wars was a man named Ulfilas, the Little Wolf. Raised partly in Roman lands, he was consecrated as bishop to his people around 341 AD. Ulfilas translated the scriptures into Gothic, crafting an alphabet from Greek and Latin letters to preserve it. He preached peace to a society that revered war, his quiet defiance more revolutionary than any spear. Though many kings mistrusted him, Christianity spread along the trade routes like a whisper. Some adopted it for faith, others for diplomacy, but in its message of destiny and redemption, The Goths recognized an echo of their own sagas. Not all embraced it. The pagan aristocracy, fearing the loss of tradition, persecuted converts. Athanaric himself led purges against Christians within his domain, burning villages that refused to renounce the foreign god. For the first time, Goth fought Goth over belief. The division between pagan and Christian, east and west, set the stage for centuries of turmoil and for the reshaping of Europe's soul. While faith divided them, danger united them. From the east came a new terror, the Huns. Swift, mounted, and merciless, they fell upon the Gothic frontiers like thunder. Villages vanished overnight, fortresses emptied without resistance. None had seen such warfare. Arrows darkening the sky, horsemen who seemed born to the saddle, their faces scarred, their eyes cold as obsidian. The Goths, accustomed to dominating the plains, now fled before an enemy faster and more disciplined than themselves. The arrival of the Huns, around 370 AD, shattered the fragile balance of the north. Ermanaric's eastern empire collapsed in rebellion. Athanaric's western tribes were driven toward the Danube, seeking refuge beyond the river. Tens of thousands of Gothic families gathered along the banks, their wagons laden with the remnants of their lives. Behind them burned their villages. Ahead lay Rome's frontier, guarded but vulnerable. The Gothic kings sent envoys to the Emperor Valens, begging for asylum. They offered loyalty in exchange for land, service for safety. Valens, cautious but overconfident, agreed to their crossing. In 376 AD, the river swarmed with barges bearing the refugees of an entire nation. They were disarmed, registered, and resettled within the empire's boundaries, an unprecedented act of mercy or folly, depending on the teller. What followed was less salvation than slow betrayal. Roman officials extorted the newcomers, selling them dog meat for gold, enslaving their children, violating every term of the treaty. Hunger turned gratitude into rage. In secret, the Gothic leaders, among them Fritigern, once ally of Valens, prepared for revolt. They had seen Rome's weakness firsthand, an empire that mistook cruelty for control. Before the inevitable rebellion, a fragile peace lingered. In that brief lull, Gothic craftsmen worked Roman iron into their own designs, merging styles, tempering identities. In their hilltop villages stood altars to Christ beside idols of the old gods, as though both faiths were testing which would endure. The tribes no longer lived outside civilization. They lived within its cracks. The Gothic dawn was therefore not a sunrise, but a glimmer before storm. Out of the steppe and the forest had come a people hardened by movement, educated by their enemies, divided by belief. They stood now at the empire's threshold, both heirs and executioners of the world that had shaped them. The Huns still thundered behind them. Rome waited ahead. Between those two forces lay destiny, and its name was Adrianople. From the eastern steppes came a wind that carried ruin. Horsemen rode with it, small, sinewy, and tireless, driving before them waves of fugitives who darkened the horizon. The Huns had entered Europe. To those who glimpsed their advance, it was as though the apocalypse itself had taken flesh. Fields vanished beneath hooves. Cities disappeared in smoke, and entire nations fled westward in terror. The first to face them were the Goths. For generations they had ruled the plains north of the Black Sea, masters of the steppe, lords of trade and war. But even they were unprepared for the storm that now swept upon them. The Huns struck without warning or mercy, their arrows finding gaps between shields as if guided by malice itself. Villages burned overnight. Kings fell. The world that Ermanaric and Athanaric had built was erased within months. Desperation forced choice. The Gothic people divided. In the east, the Grötungi, led by nobles still clinging to pagan rites, attempted resistance. In the west, the Tavini, guided by Fritigern, sought survival through retreat. They crossed rivers and marshes, driving their herds and families ahead of them, pursued by a terror that moved faster than rumor. Behind them lay the ruins of their homeland. Before them glimmered the empire they had once raided. The Romans called it civilization. To the refugees, it was refuge. In the summer of 376 AD, the Gothic envoys appeared before Emperor Valens, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. They begged permission to cross the Danube and settle under imperial protection. Valens, hoping to gain soldiers and weaken the Huns, agreed. The terms were simple. The Goths would surrender their weapons, give up their hostages, and serve Rome as allies. Across the wide river they came, men, women, and children in endless procession. Barges and rafts ferried them by the thousand. Roman officers watched from the far bank as a nation uprooted itself, not realizing that their mercy would soon birth disaster. Bureaucrats mishandled the settlement. Commanders extorted food and supplies. Grain meant for the refugees was hoarded or sold at extortionate prices. Families starved. Children were sold into slavery for scraps of meat. In that humiliation, fury grew. Fritigern, once a loyal ally, turned to war. His followers reclaimed their weapons and struck at their supposed benefactors. Villages burned from the Danube to the Balkans. The rebellion spread faster than the imperial army could contain it. Valens, unwilling to wait for reinforcements from the west, decided to crush the Goths himself. The two forces met near Adrianople in 378 AD. The day was blindingly hot. The dust rose so thick it turned the sun red. Valens believed the enemy weaker than they were, for the Gothic cavalry had not yet appeared. When the legions advanced, Fritigern's wagons seemed vulnerable, a trap of deliberate stillness. Then the ground shook. The hidden horsemen, returning from a raid, charged down upon the Roman flank. The formation broke. Arrows rained from every direction. The disciplined lines dissolved into chaos, shields locking, not in unity, but in panic. Valens fell amid his soldiers, his body never found. 2/3 of the Eastern army perished. Rome, invincible for centuries, had been annihilated by refugees. The victory stunned the ancient world. Chroniclers called it the greatest defeat since Cannae. More prophetic voices whispered that an age had ended, that the empire had grown too vast to defend itself against those who no longer feared it. After Adrianople, the Gothic wanderings became an odyssey of desperation. Fritigern's people roamed the Balkans, burning what they could not hold, negotiating with emperors who broke every promise they made. The Huns still haunted their rear, herding them westward like wolves steering prey. Rome could not destroy them, nor could it expel them. The boundaries between conqueror and captive blurred until the two became indistinguishable. A generation later, a new leader rose among the Goths, Alaric, son of a noble house, once a soldier in the Roman army. He had fought for the empire, marched beneath its eagles, and learned its every weakness. When denied the rank and payment owed to him, he turned his loyalty inward. Gathering Visigoths, fugitive slaves, and adventurers of every tribe, he formed a new kind of army. Not a raiding host, but a wandering kingdom. Alaric's goal was not destruction, but dignity. He sought recognition, land, and legitimacy within the empire that despised him. His petitions failed, his patience broke. In 401 AD, he invaded Italy. Roman generals met him in battle, sometimes defeating, never destroying him. Famine and politics did what legions could not. Emperors rose and fell in Constantinople and Ravenna, their orders meaningless beyond the palace walls. The empire's own generals relied increasingly on Germanic soldiers to defend it, a paradox no senator could untangle. By 408 AD, Alaric stood outside Rome itself, the eternal city which had crushed Carthage and ruled the Mediterranean, faced a siege by men it had once called barbarians. Inside, the Senate debated, priests performed rituals long forgotten, and the populace waited in terror. The city surrendered without a fight, paying a ransom in gold and silver so vast it emptied the treasuries of temples. Alaric withdrew, demanding again what he wanted, a place for his people within the empire. His request was refused. Betrayal followed diplomacy, and patience turned to scorn. 2 years later, in 410 AD, the Visigothic army returned. The gates opened, whether by treachery or exhaustion, none could tell, and Rome fell. For 3 days the city was plundered. Churches were spared by Alaric's order, yet nothing could spare Rome's pride. After 8 centuries, the unconquered had been conquered. The world gasped. Pagans said the Christian God had failed. Christians said the fall was punishment for sin. The poet Jerome, hiding in Bethlehem, wrote that he trembled as he heard the footsteps of the barbarians even in his dreams. Yet to Alaric's people, the sack was not desecration, but retribution. They took what was owed and moved on, leaving Rome shaken but still breathing. The Visigoths marched south toward Sicily, planning to cross into Africa and claim its fertile provinces. Fate intervened. Alaric fell ill and died near Cosenza. His followers buried him in the bed of a diverted river, then returned the waters to their course so none might find his grave. A man who had humbled Rome vanished beneath its silence. After his death, the Gothic host wandered north again, eventually settling in Gaul and Hispania. There they founded kingdoms that would outlast the empire itself. Others, the Ostrogoths still bound by Hunnic domination, waited for their moment, serving under the shadow of a new power. Behind these transformations stood the spectre of the Huns. Their arrival had set the Great Migration in motion, scattering tribes like seeds before a storm. Yet even the Huns were not immune to the contagion of empire. They learned Roman diplomacy, adopted Roman gold, and soon demanded tribute instead of plunder. Their kings feasted in tents hung with silk, surrounded by the spoils of civilization they professed to despise. Among them rose a figure whose name would chill an age. Attila, but his story belonged to the century to come. For now, Europe lay divided between ashes and uncertainty. The frontier that had once held back the world no longer existed. The Danube was a corridor, the Rhine a rumor, and Rome itself a city that had seen its gods betrayed. Out of the ruin walked the survivors, Gothic warriors hardened by exile, Roman farmers ruined by war, slaves who had outlived their masters. Together they inhabited a continent without center, where power no longer came from marble but from movement. The Huns had opened the gate, the Goths had walked through it, and behind them the rest of the tribes were gathering. Winter came early to the year 406. Ice sealed the Rhine, and the river that had guarded Rome for centuries turned traitor. Across its frozen surface moved thousands of wagons, cattle, and armed men. The Vandals, the Suebi, and their allies, nomads from the east. They came not as raiders, but as nations in flight, driven by hunger, plague, and the Huns behind them. For the first time in memory, the frontier collapsed without a battle. The crossing was a moment of apocalypse and opportunity. Roman garrisons, thin and weary from civil war, could do little but watch. entire provinces dissolved overnight. The newcomers flooded into Gaul, plundering what they needed to survive. Cities that had stood since Caesar's time, Mainz, Worms, Strasbourg, went up in flames. Roman chroniclers would later call it the Flood of Nations, a phrase meant to evoke disaster, yet within that torrent lay the seeds of medieval Europe. The Vandals, under their king Gunderic, pushed steadily westward. They fought and feasted in equal measure, leaving ruins in their wake. The Suebi, smaller but determined, peeled south into the mountains of Hispania, where they would carve out their own enclave. The Burgundians, once Roman allies, sought refuge along the Rhone, building settlements that would one day bear their name. And wherever these tribes went, they carried both destruction and renewal. Gaul, exhausted by decades of taxation and military collapse, offered little resistance. The imperial court had already fled to Ravenna, leaving generals to defend the ghost of empire. Amid the chaos, a new order began to take shape. Germanic chieftains, familiar with Roman administration from years as mercenaries, now governed their conquered lands using the same bureaucrats who had once governed them. Coins still bore the emperor's face, though few remembered his name. The Vandals' journey did not end in Gaul. Pushed by rival tribes and the hunger of their own numbers, they crossed into Hispania around 409 AD, dividing the peninsula among themselves and their allies. The Alans claimed Lusitania. The Suebi settled in Galicia, the green country of the northwest. The Vandals occupied the rich provinces of Baetica and Carthaginensis. But peace among conquerors never lasts. The tribes turned on one another as soon as they found land to fight over. Out of this chaos rose Genseric, half Vandal, half visionary. Born around 389 AD, he inherited a kingdom forged by migration and tempered by hardship. Under his rule, the Vandals became a people of the sea. In 429 AD, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, an entire nation transported by ship. Behind them, Hispania burned. Ahead, Africa glittered with promise. Roman Africa was the empire's granary, rich with cities and ports. Within a decade, it was theirs. Genseric established his capital at Carthage, a city already ancient when Rome was young. There, among the ruins of old Punic walls, he built a new power. His fleet ruled the western Mediterranean. His warriors raided Sicily, Sardinia, and even the coasts of Italy. Rome's grain ships now sailed under Vandal flags. From the ashes of empire, a pirate kingdom had risen, disciplined and devout in its own way. Religion, as often, divided conquerors from the conquered. The Vandals followed Arian Christianity, a faith condemned by Rome as heresy. To them, Christ was the Son, but not equal to the Father, a subtlety that sparked centuries of conflict. Catholic bishops fled or were exiled. Churches were seized and rededicated. Yet Genseric's rule was not mindless persecution. He governed with the cunning of a man who knew that tolerance, too, could be a weapon. By protecting some and punishing others, he kept his new subjects balanced between gratitude and fear. Meanwhile, in the far northwest, the Suebi had founded a kingdom in what is now Galicia and northern Portugal. Their chieftain, Hermeric, and his successors ruled from the town of Braga, blending Germanic custom with Roman law. Roads were repaired, taxes collected, bishops appointed. Within a generation, the invaders had become monarchs, their rough assemblies transformed into councils of nobles. The Suebi were among the first of the tribes to convert fully to Catholic Christianity, and their kings boasted of divine favour. In Gaul, the Burgundians followed a similar path. Originally allies of Rome, they had been granted lands along the Rhone under imperial sanction. a feudus or treaty that recognized them as partners in defense. But partnership soon became possession. Their capital at Lyon flourished, and their Lex Burgundionum, a written code blending Germanic custom with Roman precedent, became a model for later medieval law. Out of these pragmatic arrangements, the idea of Europe's Christian kingship began to take form. Not all of Rome's new neighbours were so accommodating. The Bargaudai, bands of peasant rebels in Gaul and Hispania, rose against both imperial tax collectors and barbarian lords alike. These revolts, rooted in desperation rather than ideology, blurred every boundary. Some Bargaudai joined the Suebi. Others were crushed by Roman generals such as Aetius, the last great commander of the West. He played the barbarians like pieces on a chessboard, allying one tribe against another, delaying the empire's death by sheer cunning. Aetius's diplomacy reached even the Huns. As a youth, he had lived among them as a hostage, learning their language and customs. Now, as Rome's defender, he summoned them as allies. Their horsemen swept across Gaul at his command, striking fear into the very people who had once fled them. Yet alliances born of desperation carry their own poison. The Huns soon demanded payment beyond Rome's means, and their king, Attila, began to dream of conquest rather than cooperation. By the 440s, Attila's empire stretched from the Ural Mountains to the Rhine, a realm of terror sustained by tribute. His armies included not only Huns, but thousands of Germanic warriors, Goths, Gepids, Heruli, and others, serving for gold, loot, or survival. The line between oppressor and ally vanished entirely. Some fought for Attila out of hatred for Rome, others because they feared his wrath more than imperial justice. Genseric watched all this from his palace in Carthage with the patience of a predator. When Attila threatened the west, the Vandal king tightened his control of the sea, cutting supply lines, waiting for the storm to pass. His fleets ravaged Sicily and the coasts of Greece, striking where the empire could least defend. In 455 AD, when internal treachery tore Rome apart, Genseric sailed north once more. His ships filled the Tiber. His men entered the Eternal City through unbarred gates. The sack of Rome by the Vandals was not the massacre later centuries imagined. Churches were spared, citizens enslaved rather than slaughtered. Yet the symbolism was irresistible. Twice in half a century, the mistress of the world had been humbled by those she once dismissed as barbarians. Genseric departed after 2 weeks, laden with treasure and captives. Among the spoils was the Empress Eudoxia, taken to Carthage as both prize and hostage, a living emblem of imperial ruin. In the wreckage of the Western Empire, only fragments of Roman authority remained. Provinces became kingdoms. Governors became kings. The Vandals ruled Africa. The Suebi held Iberia's northwest. The Burgundians thrived along the Rhone. Each of these realms claimed to uphold Rome's legacy, even as they buried it. By mid-century, the map of Europe had changed beyond recognition. What had begun as migration had become transformation. The barbarians no longer stood outside civilization. They had replaced it. And on the northern plains, under the dark shadow of the Huns, new claimants were already gathering strength for the next chapter of the age. The rise of Attila, the fall of empires, and the birth of kings. When the smoke cleared from the Vandals' sack of Rome in 455 AD, the Western Empire was a carcass picked clean. Its provinces were gone, its armies divided, its emperors ghosts in borrowed palaces. The city that had once ruled the world now ruled nothing but its own memory. The tribes that had once trembled before Rome now fought to inherit its body. In the decades that followed, Kings and generals rose like waves and broke as quickly. The Vandals sailed unchallenged from Carthage, their fleets gleaming on the horizon. The Visigoths, settled in Gaul, pushed south into Hispania. The Burgundians built cities on the Rhone and minted coins bearing both Latin and Germanic legends. In northern Italy, the imperial throne itself had become a game of survival, with one barbarian warlord after another pulling its strings. At the center of this collapsing world stood Aetius, the last great Roman commander of the West. He had once balanced the empire's enemies against one another like a master of chess, using Huns to check Goths, Goths to subdue rebels, diplomacy to postpone disaster. Yet even he could not stop the coming tide. The alliance he had forged with the Huns broke the moment Attila decided to rule rather than serve. In 451 AD, the two forces met on the Catalonian plains near modern-day Chalons. There, Romans and Visigoths fought side by side against Attila's massive army of Huns and their Germanic vassals. The battle raged into night, fought amid rain and dust and the cries of dying kings. When morning came, neither side could claim victory, but Attila had withdrawn. The world hailed it as Rome's last triumph. In truth, it was merely a pause. 2 years later, Attila invaded Italy itself. Cities fell, refugees flooded the roads. Only famine, disease, and the whispered words of Pope Leo convinced him to turn back. Soon afterward, he died in his tent on his wedding night, choking on his own blood. His empire collapsed as swiftly as it had risen, and his Germanic followers, Gepids, Rugians, Heruli, and Ostrogoths, turned their swords against one another for spoils. The void left by the Huns created a scramble for power across the former Roman world. In Gaul, the Visigoths, under Theodoric II, became the dominant power. In Africa, Genseric's Vandals reigned from Carthage, with fleets that strangled the Mediterranean. Italy remained the empire's heart in name, but not in spirit. Emperors ruled from Ravenna, a city of marshes and mosaics, protected more by the sea than by legions. Around them gathered a court of eunuchs, generals, and Germanic mercenaries, all waiting for Rome's pulse to stop. Among those mercenaries was a man of mixed heritage, Ricimer, the son of a Suebi father and a Roman mother. He served as commander of the imperial army and master of its fate. Unable to sit on the throne himself because of his barbarian blood, Ricimer placed puppet emperors upon it instead, discarding each when they grew inconvenient. Between 456 and 472, he made and unmade rulers with the ease of a man changing garments. His power was absolute, his legitimacy none. Under Ricimer's rule, the empire became theatre. Taxes were collected but not spent. The Senate debated in echoing halls. Armies fought under banners that meant nothing. When Ricimer died, there was no one left capable of pretending. Italy belonged not to Rome, but to its hired swords. From this chaos rose new forces. In the north, the Ostrogoths, freed from Hunnic domination, migrated into Pannonia. Their young prince, Theodoric, was sent as a hostage to Constantinople, where he learned the language and ceremony of empire. In the west, the Visigoths conquered Toulouse, then Narbonne, then all of southern Gaul. The Vandals continued to plunder the sea, while the Franks, still divided, began to unite under ambitious chieftains. The map of the ancient world blurred into something unrecognizable. The final act of the Western Empire unfolded in absurdity. In 475 AD, a Roman general of Pannonian birth named Orestes seized control of the government. He placed his teenage son on the throne as Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. The name was a cruel irony. Romulus founder of Rome, and Augustus, its first emperor, reborn in a boy who would become its last. Orestes' army was composed largely of Germanic federates, Heruli, Syrians, and Rugians, men who fought not for glory, but for land. When he refused to grant them the estates they were promised, their patience ended. They turned to one of their own officers, a quiet, formidable soldier of Syrian descent named Odoacer. In 476 AD, Odoacer marched on Ravenna. The city surrendered without resistance. Orestes was executed. His son was spared and quietly retired to a villa in Campania. Odoacer took the imperial insignia, the diadem and the purple robe, and sent them east to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was enough for both halves of the world. The Western Roman Empire was finished. The event passed with hardly a battle. No burning of cities, no shattering of statues, just a letter, a surrender, and a silence that would last for centuries. The empire that had survived Hannibal, civil war, and invasion had fallen to a man who sought not to destroy it, but to wear its name. Odoacer ruled Italy as Rex, not emperor. He preserved the Senate, maintained the roads, paid the army. Latin remained the language of law. Christianity remained the state's faith. Yet beneath this facade, everything had changed. Power now flowed from the sword, not the title. The new king wore a Roman cloak, but spoke in the tongue of his ancestors. His followers, half Roman and half barbarian, saw themselves not as conquerors, but as heirs. In the provinces, life adapted. Farmers sowed, merchants traded, bishops preached. The transition from empire to kingdom was less a collapse than a slow metamorphosis. The Germanic leaders who had once plundered Rome now ruled in its image, imitating the structures they had shattered. The word Romanus no longer meant citizenship, it meant culture. Across the Alps, the Franks expanded into northern Gaul, their chieftains already dreaming of a single crown. In Hispania, the Visigoths built stone basilicas and codified laws in Latin. Even in distant Carthage, the Vandals maintained Roman administration, their Arian bishops debating theology with Nicene counterparts. The barbarians had not destroyed civilization. They had inherited it, reshaped it, and made it their own. Yet the illusion of peace could not last. Odoacer's rise had unsettled Constantinople, where Emperor Zeno viewed him as a usurper. To remove him, Zeno turned to the Ostrogoths, now led by Theodoric, the son of that same noble once sent to the Byzantine court. In 488 AD, Theodoric led his people across the Alps into Italy, marching not as an invader, but as an imperial envoy, promised the land he could conquer. The war lasted 5 years. Ravenna, once again the stage of history, endured siege after siege, until Odoacer agreed to a banquet of reconciliation. There, beneath the same vaulted ceilings where Roman emperors had once dined, Theodoric struck him down with his own hand. The blow ended a reign and began an age. When the blood dried, Theodoric the Ostrogoth ruled Italy in the emperor's name. His kingdom would blend Roman order with Gothic vigor, creating a fragile harmony between worlds that no longer knew how to be separate. Thus ended the story of Rome's fall, not in flame, but in transformation. The eagle had folded its wings, yet from its shadow rose a host of new standards: Gothic, Vandal, Burgundian, Frankish. Each bore something of the empire that had shaped them, and in the stillness after conquest, the world began to dream again, not of Rome, the eternal, but of Europe, the unborn. The death of Odoacer in 493 AD did not end the Roman world. It reassembled it in a different tongue. In Ravenna, Theodoric, leader of the Ostrogoths, took the throne not as destroyer, but as heir. The Eastern Emperor had named him Patricius and granted him Italy as a fief. Yet what emerged was no vassal state. Theodoric ruled as king in everything but title, shaping a realm where Gothic strength upheld Roman law. The new king was unlike any conqueror Rome had ever known. Tall, austere, educated in Constantinople, he understood both the sword and the scroll. His court blended two civilizations. Gothic nobles with braided hair stood beside Roman senators draped in faded togas. Laws were issued in Latin. Judgments were rendered by Gothic custom. Theodoric's signature sealed decrees that echoed imperial forms. It was as if the empire had shed its skin and worn the pelt of the north. In Ravenna, marble churches rose again, their mosaics glittering with gold. Theodoric rebuilt aqueducts, restored the harbours, and revived trade with Africa and the East. Farmers returned to fields once left to weeds, and artisans filled workshops that had been silent since the wars. For half a generation, Italy flourished. The dream of order, Roman in structure, Gothic in spirit, seemed briefly real. Yet it was a dream, balanced on contradiction. The Romans and Goths lived side by side, but not together. The Gothic warriors, fewer in number, owned the land. The Romans, numerous but subdued, held the pens. Even religion divided them. Theodoric followed the Arian creed, while his subjects were loyal to Nicene Christianity. For years he tolerated both, insisting that conscience was beyond law. But tolerance in an age of suspicion is never eternal. To the east, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian looked westward with envy and nostalgia. From Constantinople, he ruled an empire of law and ceremony, imagining himself the heir to all that Rome had been. When he looked upon Italy, he saw not a kingdom, but a stolen province. His ambition was not conquest, but restoration. The renovatio imperii, the renewal of empire, and in Theodoric's descendants, he saw opportunity. Theodoric's reign lasted more than 30 years. When he died in 526, he left no capable heir. His daughter, Amalasuntha, educated and brilliant, tried to continue his policy of coexistence. But the Gothic nobility mistrusted a woman who spoke Greek and quoted Virgil. She ruled in name, hostage to her own counselors. Civil strife followed, and when her cousin Theodahad betrayed her to rivals who strangled her in a bath, the pretext for invasion was complete. In 535 AD, Justinian unleashed his general Belisarius, a man whose genius was matched only by his loyalty. The Byzantine fleet landed in Sicily, then advanced northward. City after city surrendered, convinced that the empire had returned. At first, the war seemed a triumph of strategy and faith. The Byzantines recaptured Rome itself, parading the imperial standards through its ruined streets. But Italy had changed since the days of the Caesars. The cities were empty, the people weary, and the invaders spoke Latin with an accent of exile. The war dragged on for nearly 20 years, a conflict remembered simply as the Gothic War. Towns were taken and retaken until they became graves. The countryside starved, and plague followed famine. The once prosperous peninsula turned into a wasteland of ghosts. Even Belisarius, weary of endless victory, begged to return home. The Byzantine chroniclers called it liberation. The survivors called it ruin. While Belisarius fought in the south, a Gothic warrior named Totila rose in the north. Young, eloquent, and ruthless, he revived the dying cause. His letters to the Senate combined courtesy with warning. Rome, he said, should belong to those who defended it. For a moment, the Gothic banners flew once more over the city's walls, But strength could not outlast starvation. When Totila fell in battle in 552, the Gothic nation fell with him. Justinian's armies claimed victory, but it was a victory that devoured itself. The war had cost more than conquest could repay. Italy's population dwindled, its fields lay barren, its roads vanished beneath weeds. The dream of restoration turned to dust even before the emperor's death. The Byzantines held what they had taken, but the land itself belonged to no one. Beyond the ruins of Italy, the wider Germanic world moved on. In Gaul, the Franks under the Merovingians were forging a kingdom that blended barbarian vigor with Roman administration. Their kings ruled by the grace of God rather than the favor of the emperor, their law written in the language of the people rather than the Senate. To the west, the Visigoths in Hispania, under Euric and Leovigild, consolidated their power, issuing codes that mixed Latin precision with Germanic fairness. Even the defeated Burgundians, absorbed by the Franks, left their mark. Their legal code, the Lex Burgundionum, became a foundation for European jurisprudence. Across the continent, what had been Roman now existed in fragments. In the laws of the Franks, the architecture of Ravenna, the language of the church. Theodoric's experiment in coexistence had not survived, but its idea endured. The synthesis of Rome and the tribes was no longer a dream. It was the fabric of the new world. As the dust of war settled, new invaders approached. In 568 AD, a fresh wave of Germanic warriors, the Lombards, descended from the north, led by Alboin. They were hard men from Pannonia, heirs of the Suebi and the Saxons, and they came not as allies of Byzantium, but as settlers. Within years they seized most of Italy, leaving the Byzantines clinging to a few coastal cities. The cycle had begun again, empire yielding to kingdom, kingdom dissolving into faith and tribe. But something had changed. Each conquest now built upon the ruins of civilization rather than erasing it. The Lombards adopted Latin titles, issued their edicts in Roman form, and ruled from cities that had once flown imperial banners. The Gothic age had shown them how. When later chroniclers looked back upon this century, they did not see barbarians and emperors, victors and vanquished. They saw a single long transformation, a world shedding its ancient skin to become something unimagined. The Gothic wars had ended the empire of marble and begun the Europe of stone. In the basilicas of Ravenna, the mosaics of Theodoric still gleamed long after his people were gone. Christ sat enthroned against a field of gold, flanked by apostles in white robes. Below, the figures of Gothic warriors, rendered in eternal mosaic, marched toward paradise. The king himself was nowhere to be seen. His image had been erased by order of the new rulers, yet his presence lingered in the symmetry of the art, in the stubborn endurance of beauty amid desolation. The world had lost Rome, but found continuity. Out of conquest came governance, out of ruin, renewal. The Goths had burned the empire and then rebuilt it in their own likeness, leaving behind the blueprint of kingdoms that would call themselves holy, Roman, and eternal. And as the Lombards pressed south and the Franks spread west, the horizon of history shifted once more, from Italy's ashes to the fertile valleys of Gaul, where a young dynasty prepared to claim the legacy of both sword and cross. In the ruins of empire, one tribe learned not merely to conquer, but to govern. The Franks, once loose confederations along the lower Rhine, had watched the Roman world crumble and absorbed its lessons. They saw that power required not only force, but faith, not only war, but law. From these fragments, they built something new, a kingdom that would shape the destiny of the West. Their ascent began in the twilight of the 5th century, when the land between the Rhine and the Seine was a patchwork of chaos. The Romans were gone, the Goths preoccupied, and the Burgundians weakened. Into this vacuum stepped a young warlord named Clovis, son of Childeric, chief of the Salian Franks. He was barely 15 when he inherited his father's small domain around Tournai. Within a generation, he would command all of Gaul. Clovis was both barbarian and statesman. His warriors fought bareheaded, with long hair bound behind them as a sign of freedom. Yet he used diplomacy with the precision of a general. By allying with remnants of Roman aristocracy, he made conquest appear as restoration. He crushed the last Roman governor of Gaul, Syagrius, at Soissons, taking his territory and his prestige. Then he turned on rival tribes, defeating the Alemanni at Tolbiac in a battle remembered as half miracle, half massacre. It was at Tolbiac that legend says his destiny changed. As the tide of battle turned against him, Clovis called upon the god of his Christian wife, Clotilde. "Grant me victory, and I will believe." The Alemanni fell, their king slain, and Clovis kept his vow. In 496 AD, he was baptized in Rheims by Bishop Remigius, accompanied by 3,000 of his warriors. The oil of the church replaced the blood of the battlefield as the sign of kingship. Where other Germanic rulers embraced the Arian heresy, Clovis accepted the Catholic faith, aligning himself with Rome's priests and Gaul's bishops. It was a masterstroke. In an instant, the church gained a champion, and Clovis gained legitimacy. The Franks, once outsiders, became the sword of Western Christendom. Across Gaul, bishops blessed his banners. Cities opened their gates. Rivals who clung to pagan gods found themselves isolated. The conversion was as political as it was spiritual, but history seldom distinguishes between the two. After Tolbiac came consolidation. Clovis subdued the Burgundians and the Visigoths, driving the latter from Gaul after the Battle of Vouillé in 507 AD. His realm now stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Atlantic to the upper Danube. Yet he ruled not as emperor, but as Rex Francorum, king of the Franks, a title both humble and revolutionary. Power no longer descended from Rome's Senate or Byzantium's favor. It sprang from the anointing of God and the consent of warriors. Clovis governed through a blend of instinct and imitation. He retained the Roman tax system, employed Gallo-Roman administrators, and issued a written code, the Lex Salica. It preserved ancient Frankish customs, yet wrapped them in the language of Latin law. Under its clauses, inheritance passed through the male line. Blood feuds were replaced by fixed fines called weregilds, and offences against the church carried divine as well as temporal penalties. In its synthesis of tradition and order lay the seed of European jurisprudence. The unity Clovis forged was fragile. After his death in 511, the kingdom fractured among his sons according to tribal custom. The Merovingian dynasty he founded was strong in lineage, but weak in discipline. His heirs, Childebert, Clothar, Theuderic, and Clodomir, fought one another as eagerly as their father had fought outsiders. For 2 centuries, the Frankish lands oscillated between brilliance and bloodshed, their kings alternately patrons of saints and butchers of kin. Even so, the structure Clovis built endured. His capital at Paris became the heart of a new civilization. Monasteries rose along the Seine and the Loire, their stone cloisters humming with prayer and learning. From Ireland to Italy, monks carried the light of literacy through the wreckage of the old world. The Latin tongue survived in their manuscripts. The Christian calendar replaced pagan reckonings of time. Meanwhile, the Franks absorbed their neighbours. The Burgundians were annexed, their laws rewritten. The Alemanni and Thuringians were subdued. Even distant Bavaria bent to Frankish influence. The tribal world that had once defied Rome was slowly being knitted into a patchwork of duchies, owing allegiance to the same crown. Europe's political map began to take its medieval shape. Religion bound this fragile order together. Bishops became royal councillors, abbots oversaw vast estates. Kings endowed monasteries to pray for their souls and legitimize their reigns. Yet the marriage of sword and cross was uneasy. Violence remained the first language of power. In the halls of Metz or Soissons, gold crucifixes gleamed beside blood-stained axes. The piety of the Merovingians never softened their politics. Queens plotted assassinations. Courtiers were blinded or strangled in the name of order. Chroniclers such as Gregory of Tours, horrified yet fascinated, called it a world where holiness and savagery slept side by side. Farther south, other Germanic kingdoms faced their own reckonings. In Italy, the Lombards, heirs to the Gothic and Suebi traditions, seized the peninsula's heartlands. Their warriors, rough and pragmatic, divided territory among dukes while acknowledging a single king. To the east, the Byzantine Empire clung to Ravenna and the coasts, ruling through governors who taxed but could not protect. The dream of Justinian's restoration had faded. The reality of regional power endured. North of the Alps, the Franks stood apart. They did not merely survive the fall of Rome, they reinvented the idea of rulership. Their kings, though often brutal, governed as mediators between heaven and earth. The anointing of oil at Rheims became a sacrament, the visible mark of divine favor. Even civil war, framed as penance and judgment, strengthened the church's hand. Slowly, the warrior tribes of Gaul transformed into the Christian realm that would one day call itself France. Beyond the Rhine, the old Germanic world watched and waited. The Saxons still clung to their gods of oak and thunder. The Frisians ruled the northern seas, their traders sailing between Britain and the Baltic. The Bavarians guarded their valleys with stubborn independence. Yet the Franks' influence seeped across borders like the flow of their rivers. Their coinage became currency in distant markets. Their priests brought Latin hymns to foreign shrines. A new order was taking shape, not imperial, but cultural. By the 7th century, the Merovingian kings had become figures of legend and irony. Long-haired and slow-moving, they sat upon thrones while their officials, the mayors of the palace, wielded the real power. The most ambitious of these administrators, descendants of Clovis's captains, would soon eclipse the dynasty itself. Among their heirs would rise a family whose name would define the next chapter of Europe's story, the Carolingians. Yet before that dawn, the Frankish world reached an unexpected maturity. Its cities revived, its markets flourished, and its faith deepened. Pilgrims walked roads once patrolled by Roman legions. Scholars copied texts thought lost forever. Even in their brutality, the Franks carried forward the idea of continuity, the belief that history, like faith, could be redeemed. When later ages looked back on the Merovingian centuries, they saw confusion and violence. But beneath the blood lay structure, law codes, churches, and roads that endured. The Franks had turned the ruins of empire into the scaffolding of Christendom. From this foundation would rise a new empire, one that claimed both the heritage of Rome and the soul of the Germanic tribes. And at its heart stood the legacy of Clovis, the sword baptized in faith, raised not only to conquer, but to build. When Rome's legions withdrew from Britain around 410 AD, The island became a whisper between worlds, half memory, half opportunity. The cities crumbled, villas fell silent, and the fields that had once fed legions returned to forest and marsh. Into that void came new settlers from across the North Sea, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, drawn by rumour and wind. They were farmers and warriors both, kinsmen of the Franks, heirs to the old Germanic world that still worshipped gods of sky and sea. Their journey began in hunger. Rising seas and overworked soil in their homelands of Jutland and Lower Saxony pushed them outward. Their longboats, narrow and shallow-keeled, could ride both wave and river, allowing entire clans to migrate together. They followed the coasts, raiding at first, then settling where resistance faltered. To the native Britons, left leaderless after Rome's retreat, the newcomers seemed a plague sent by the gods they had forsaken. Villages burned, and the island fractured into fragments of old allegiance and new ambition. Over decades, migration became conquest. The Angles established themselves in the north and east, in lands that would one day bear their name: East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria. The Saxons took the south, from Sussex to Wessex, while the Jutes claimed Kent. The patchwork of tribes hardened into small kingdoms, each ruled by a warlord whose power rested on the loyalty of his hearth companions. Their councils, witan, echoed the ancient thing, assemblies of the continent, where men gathered in open air to debate law and fate beneath the gods. The wars that followed were brutal, but strangely creative. The native Britons retreated westward into Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them fragments of Latin speech and Christian faith. In the east, pagan shrines rose once more. Smoke from sacrificial fires mingled with mist along the fens, and the names of forgotten deities returned to the tongue: Woden, Thuna, Tew, and Frigg. Yet even as they rebuilt their world upon ruins, the settlers carried echoes of the civilization they had never known. Their craftsmen forged iron spearheads patterned after Roman forms. Their kings adopted titles of Latin origin. They buried their dead with swords and ornaments, but also with coins from a distant empire whose ghosts they could not escape. In this paradox, the pagan draped in imperial memory, lay the foundation of medieval England. By the 6th century, the island had splintered into the Heptarchy, 7 great kingdoms forever at war and occasionally at peace. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Each claimed dominion, none achieved it. Alliances shifted with the seasons, and kings fell as quickly as they rose. Yet amid the warfare, a culture began to take root, one that honored loyalty above life, fame above peace. The poetry of the age reflected that code. Warriors gathered in timbered halls, lit by whale oil lamps, listening to singers recount the deeds of heroes who had crossed the sea generations before. These songs, later written down as Beowulf, spoke of courage in the face of doom, of the thin line between man and legend. In their rhythms pulsed the same fatalism that had driven the tribes from the continent, the conviction that fate, wyrd, ruled all, and that glory was the only answer to mortality. Christianity returned slowly, borne not by armies, but by missionaries. From the west came the Celtic monks of Ireland, from the south, the envoys of Rome. In 597 AD, Augustine of Canterbury landed in Kent, sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo-Saxon kings. His host, Ethelbert of Kent, listened warily, but allowed the new faith to take root. Stone churches rose where groves had once stood. The cross replaced the hammer, but not without struggle. Conversion spread unevenly. Northumbria embraced it early under King Edwin, then lapsed into paganism before accepting it again through Oswald, who united battle and prayer in a single act of devotion. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow became centres of learning that preserved not only scripture, but fragments of classical knowledge. The illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels, adorned with intricate knotwork, fused Celtic artistry with Roman devotion, a visual symbol of the island's dual soul. Meanwhile, on the continent, the Saxons who had stayed behind resisted the tide of conversion. For 2 centuries they defied both missionary and emperor. Their forests remained sanctuaries for the old gods, their warriors sworn to the thunder god Donar. The conflict between pagan Saxons and Christian Franks would one day erupt in the brutal campaigns of Charlemagne. But for now, the fires of the old religion still burned in the north. In Britain, the centuries unfolded like the tides that shaped its coasts. Trade linked the kingdoms to the wider world. Glass from Francia, silk from Byzantium, slaves from Ireland. Kings measured their strength not only by conquest, but by their ability to command artisans and scribes. The written word, once the monopoly of Rome, returned under the sign of the cross. Latin became the language of law and liturgy. Old English, the speech of the people, grew rich in borrowed words and poetic invention. The 8th century brought both glory and peril. Mercia, under kings like Offa, rose to dominance, its borders marked by earthworks such as Offa's Dyke, a monumental frontier separating Saxon and Britain. Offa corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal, minted coins bearing his own image, and ruled with a mixture of pagan pride and Christian ceremony. Yet beneath his grandeur, the old tribal rivalries persisted. No peace lasted long, and each generation inherited not the crown of England, but the burden of its division. The storm that ended this fragile balance came from across the same seas that had once delivered the settlers. In 793 AD, Norse longships raided Lindisfarne, slaughtering monks and looting holy relics. To later chroniclers, it was divine punishment, a reckoning for sins and arrogance. But to those who remembered older tales, it felt like a return, a reminder that the northern gods had never truly left. The Vikings were cousins of the Saxons and Angles, sharing their tongue, their gods, and their restlessness. They came not as strangers, but as reflections. For nearly a century, the island suffered their onslaught. Entire kingdoms fell, monasteries burned. Yet out of devastation came unification. Faced with the common enemy, rival kings at last began to see themselves as one people. The great heathen army, arriving in 865 AD, swept through Northumbria and East Anglia, establishing settlements rather than camps. The conquerors divided the land, calling their territory the Danelaw, where Norse and Saxon laws coexisted uneasily. For a generation, it seemed the old gods would triumph after all. But in the southern kingdom of Wessex, a single ruler turned the tide, Alfred the Great. Alfred was more than a warrior. He built fortresses, trained armies, and commissioned translations of sacred texts into the language of his people. He saw learning as a form of defense, faith as a weapon stronger than steel. Under his rule, England began to imagine itself not as a collection of tribes, but as a nation. His descendants would complete what he began, uniting the island under one crown. By the dawn of the 10th century, the line between Saxon and Angle, Dane and Briton had blurred beyond meaning. Their blood, their laws, and their languages had fused. The age of migrations had become the age of kingdoms. Out of the fury of conquest and conversion, Britain had been remade, a northern mirror of the transformation that the Franks had wrought upon the continent. The old sagas still survived in whispers, their gods remembered in the days of the week, their heroes in the echoes of poetry. yet above them rose the sound of bells calling to prayer, marking the rhythm of a new civilization. The tribes who had once fled their homeland had found another, and in that finding they had forged a new world. From the banks of the Rhine to the fields of Lombardy, a single name began to resound in the 8th century. Charles, son of Pepin the Short, grandson of a line of palace mayors who had once served Merovingian kings too weak to rule. His reign would reunite the Western world under the banner of both sword and cross. History would call him Charlemagne, the Great Charles, builder of an empire and shaper of a faith. His inheritance was neither peaceful nor certain. The Franks were still divided between Austrasia in the east and Neustria in the west, and their frontiers pressed against restless neighbours. The Lombards in Italy, the Avars in Pannonia, and most fiercely, the Saxons of the northern forests. Charlemagne understood early that to hold Gaul was to defend the frontier. To defend it was to conquer it. He began with diplomacy, but trusted more in steel. In 774 AD, he crossed the Alps and crushed the Lombard kingdom, taking their crown for himself. The act joined Italy to his dominion and made him protector of the papacy. The Pope, beset by enemies on every side, found in Charles not merely a patron, but a weapon. Their alliance, sacred, strategic, and self-serving, would define the Middle Ages. Yet it was in the north that Charlemagne faced his most relentless foes. The Saxons, cousins of the Angles and kin to the old pagan tribes, had never bowed to Rome nor Christ. Their gods ruled in the oaks and rivers, and their chieftains measured power by defiance. For more than 30 years, Charles waged war against them, a conflict not of armies, but of civilizations. The Saxon campaigns began in 772, when he ordered the destruction of the Irminsul, a great wooden pillar that symbolized the axis of their world. The monument burned, the forest echoed with cries of vengeance. Every spring thereafter, Frankish columns marched northward, burning villages, baptizing captives, and planting churches where groves had stood. Conversion came at sword's edge. Those who refused were slaughtered. Those who submitted were bound by oaths sworn over relics they scarcely understood. The rebellion never ceased. Led by the chieftain Widukind, the Saxons struck back from the marshes, ambushing convoys, slaughtering priests. For every baptism forced, another village rose in revolt. In 782, at Verdun, Charlemagne lost patience. He ordered the execution of more than 4,000 prisoners, an act that broke Saxon resistance but left a stain even his admirers could not ignore. Still, the wars continued. Only after 2 decades of devastation did Widukind accept baptism, a ceremony more truce than transformation. The chroniclers praised Charlemagne as the hammer of pagans. The Saxons remembered him as the slaughterer of their people. Yet through fire and blood, he achieved what no emperor since Augustus had done. He united a continent beneath a single law and faith. His conquests extended east to the Elbe, south to the Pyrenees, north to the North Sea. The Avars were crushed, their treasure paraded in triumph through Aachen. The Bavarians were subdued and baptized. The Lombards, now subjects, guarded Italy in his name. Each victory fed the legend of a Christian Caesar reborn. As his empire expanded, so too did his vision. Charlemagne saw himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a shepherd of civilization. He summoned scholars from every corner of Christendom, Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, Theodulf of Orleans, and set them to work in scriptoria and schools. The revival that followed would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance. In monasteries and palaces, scribes copied classical texts, preserving them from the oblivion that had swallowed so much of the ancient world. Latin grammar became a weapon as sharp as the Frankish sword. At Aachen, his favorite city, Charlemagne built a palace modeled on Roman grandeur, colonnades, marble halls, and a chapel inspired by Ravenna's mosaics. Yet its heart was northern, a court of warriors and priests, its language roughened by the accents of every tribe now bound to his rule. The king himself could barely write, though he tried in old age, filling wax tablets with uncertain letters. Knowledge, he said, was a form of worship, and ignorance a kind of sin. The balance between sword and scripture defined his reign. He issued capitularies, laws that governed both morals and governance. He standardized weights, measures, and coinage. He reformed the clergy and compelled bishops to act as royal administrators. His rule reached even into the family, legislating marriage, inheritance, and the care of the poor. No chieftain could claim independence from such authority, only service. In 800 AD, Charlemagne attended Christmas Mass in Rome. As he knelt before the altar, Pope Leo III placed upon his head a golden crown and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd shouted, "Carolo Augusto, Deo coronato, magno et pacifico imperatori vita et victoria." To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful emperor, life and victory. The gesture was both coronation and invention. Rome had fallen centuries before, yet in that moment it was reborn in the image of a Frankish warrior. Charlemagne accepted the title with surprise, or so he claimed. Perhaps he understood its burden. To rule an empire meant to govern contradictions. Latin and Germanic, cleric and soldier, monk and peasant. The new Holy Empire was neither Rome nor a kingdom of God. It was the first outline of Europe itself, held together by belief rather than by blood. The last years of his reign were marked by restlessness. He could not sit idle. Empire demanded movement. Yet he grew weary of campaigns and the intrigues of succession. His sons quarreled, his bishops whispered. In 814 AD, he died at Aachen, buried beneath the marble dome of his chapel, dressed in imperial robes with his sword across his knees. His empire stretched wider than any since the Caesars, but it would not long survive him. Under his son, Louis the Pious, the realm began to fracture. Piety could not replace the iron of ambition. The civil wars that followed culminated in the Treaty of Verdun, 843 AD, which divided the empire among Louis's three sons, Charles the Bald, Lothair, and Louis the German. From their rivalries emerged the outlines of future nations, France in the west, Germany in the east, and Italy in between. The dream of unity was gone, but its residue remained. The Stellinger Revolt in Saxony, a pagan uprising against forced Christianization, reminded the rulers that faith could not be imposed without memory of blood. Yet even rebellion carried the stamp of Charlemagne's world, its grievances expressed in legal petitions, its leaders invoking justice as well as vengeance. In the east, the descendants of Louis the German gave rise to the Ottonian dynasty, whose kings revived the imperial title in 962 AD as the Holy Roman Empire. It was not truly Roman, nor fully holy, yet its name carried forward the fiction that Charlemagne had made real, the notion of Europe as one Christian realm, answerable to both cross and crown. His legacy was more than empire. It was the pattern of rule itself. He had welded tribal vigor to Roman order, turning conquest into continuity. Even those who cursed his wars lived within the laws he left behind. The monks who copied his decrees in their cloisters, and the kings who claimed descent from him, all shared his conviction that faith and power were one. when chroniclers of later centuries called him Pater Europae, the father of Europe, they spoke more truth than they knew. For in the forge of his empire, the Germanic world had finally become something new, not barbarian, not Roman, but Christian and continental. And beyond the frontiers, he had pacified, in the frozen north, his distant cousins prepared to test that fragile unity once more. When the monks of Lindisfarne looked to the sea on a summer morning in 793 AD, they saw no warning in the silver light. The tide shimmered, the gulls wheeled, and then, like a mirage, black sails rose over the horizon. Long ships skimmed the waves, narrow and sleek as predators. What came ashore was not a storm of nature, but of men. Norsemen, Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, kin to the same tribes that had once crossed the North Sea to Britain, now returning with steel instead of settlement. The sack of Lindisfarne marked the beginning of an age of fire. Monasteries fell one after another, Jarrow, Iona, and the great abbey of St. Cuthbert. The chroniclers wrote that dragons had been seen in the sky, that lightning struck without thunder, that God himself had turned his face away. But the storm was no divine omen. It was history in motion. The North had awakened again. The Vikings came first as raiders, then as traders, and finally as rulers. Their world was born of hardship, narrow fjords, thin soil, winters that never ended. From this severity grew resilience and skill. Their ships, masterpieces of oak and iron, could cross oceans yet glide up rivers as shallow as a man's height. Wherever the sea reached, so too could the Northmen. In the 9th century, the raids spread like wildfire across Europe's coasts. The Danes struck England and Francia. The Norwegians turned west to Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles beyond. The Swedes moved east, rowing up the rivers of Russia toward Constantinople. The Norse name for these eastern traders was Varangians, and their path, the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, linked the Baltic to the Black Sea. They traded furs, slaves, and amber for Byzantine silk and silver. Some served as mercenaries in the emperor's personal guard, their axes gleaming in the mosaics of Constantinople. For all their ferocity, the Vikings were not simply destroyers. Wherever they went, they built. In Ireland, they founded Dublin. In Normandy, they became dukes. In the east, they founded cities like Novgorod and Kiev. They married local women, adopted local languages, and carried their myths like cargo. Stories of Odin the Wanderer, Thor the Thunderer, and Loki, the trickster who would one day undo the gods themselves. In England, the terror was constant. Armies of Danes wintered on the island, no longer content with plunder. The great heathen army of 865 AD swept across Northumbria and East Anglia, seizing York and slaughtering its kings. The land was divided into two worlds: the south, where Anglo-Saxon kings still ruled, and the north and east, where Danelaw governed by Norse custom and law. In the streets of London and Lincoln, merchants bartered in a hybrid tongue, half Norse and half English. Out of this crucible rose resistance. In the west, the kingdom of Wessex stood alone under its ruler, Alfred the Great. He rebuilt fortresses, organized militias, and learned from his enemies, adopting the Vikings' mobility while fortifying his towns. His victories at Edington and beyond forced the invaders into uneasy peace. Yet Alfred fought with more than swords. He saw learning itself as a fortress. Monasteries were rebuilt, schools reopened, and Latin texts translated into English, so that faith could not die when the fires came again. Across the Channel, the Franks faced the same tempest. Their rivers, once lifelines of trade, became avenues of invasion. Paris, Rouen, and Tours were besieged by fleets that seemed endless. Kings paid tribute, Danegeld, the gold of desperation, to buy temporary peace. The Carolingian Empire, already fractured, bent beneath the strain. From this humiliation, however, emerged a paradox. In 911 AD, a Frankish king granted a Viking leader named Rollo a duchy along the lower Seine in exchange for loyalty and defense. The land took its name from the newcomers, Normandy, the realm of the Northmen. Within a generation, their sons spoke French, prayed to the Latin god, and built cathedrals where their fathers had burned monasteries. While the Western kingdoms bled, Scandinavia itself was changing. Wealth from raids and trade transformed its chieftains into kings. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth raised runestones proclaiming that he had united his people and made them Christian. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason and later Olaf Haraldsson, canonized as Saint Olaf, spread the faith through baptism and fire alike. Sweden followed more slowly, its merchants torn between the cross and the hammer. But by the 11th century, even Uppsala's temples stood silent. The old gods retreated into legend, their names surviving only in the days of the weak. Christianization did not extinguish the northern spirit, it refined it. The same hands that once carved dragons into prows now illuminated manuscripts. The same courage that had faced the open sea turned inward to exploration and art. Saga writers in Iceland, heirs to both skald and monk, set down the oral tales of their ancestors. These epics, the Volsunga saga, the Edda, the saga of the Icelanders, preserved the mythic memory of a world that refused to vanish completely. Even as Scandinavia embraced faith, its adventurers continued to reshape the world. Norwegian explorers reached Greenland around 985 AD, and from there, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed farther west to a land of wild grapes and wooded shores, Vinland, now believed to be North America. For a moment, the reach of the Germanic peoples spanned from the fjords to the far side of the ocean. In England, the cycle of invasion and adaptation reached its climax under Nut the Great, a Danish king who conquered the island in 1016 AD, ruling over a North Sea empire that joined England, Denmark, and Norway. Nut governed with restraint and vision. He wore the crown of a Christian monarch, but maintained the discipline of a sea lord. His rule brought a rare peace to the Isles, where Saxon and Dane prayed in the same churches and judged under the same law. Still, empires built on tides do not last. After Cainut's death in 1035, his dominion fragmented, England returned to native kings, only to fall again a generation later to another descendant of Vikings, William of Normandy. When William crossed the Channel in 1066, he brought with him not the chaos of raiders, but the order of rulers. The Norman conquest closed the age of the Viking Storm by proving its paradox. The invaders had become the architects of the kingdoms they once destroyed. By the 11th century, the longships had vanished from the horizon. Scandinavian rulers built cathedrals instead of fleets. Their people farmed, traded, and wrote. The warriors who had haunted Europe's dreams became its merchants and poets, yet their legacy endured. In the English tongue, heavy with Norse words, in the laws that blended Saxon assembly with Viking pragmatism, in the myth that continued to hum beneath the Christian world like a buried drumbeat. The storm had passed, but it had remade the sky. The world that followed was no longer Roman, nor purely Christian. It was northern, woven from saga and scripture alike. The children of Odin now knelt before the cross, yet in their hearts still burned the fire of the sea. And as the 11th century dawned, that fire turned inward, no longer seeking conquest but continuity. The Germanic tribes that had once shattered empires were now the founders of nations. Long after the last longship had returned to the fjords, Europe still carried the pulse of its northern blood. The tribes who had once swept through the ruins of empire no longer moved by conquest. They moved through culture, law, and faith. Their names had changed, but their instincts endured. Across the continent, kingdoms spoke with the voices of the forest and the sea. In the east, where wild woods met the Vistula, a quiet migration reshaped the land. Farmers, craftsmen, and monks from Saxony and Thuringia followed the rivers into Slavic territory, clearing fields and founding towns. This was the Ostsiedlung, the great eastward settlement, less a march of armies than a tide of ploughs. Timber halls became churches. Trading posts grew into cities: Magdeburg, Leipzig, Danzig. New villages bore names that blended German and Slavic sounds, proof of an expansion driven as much by necessity as faith. What the legions of Rome had failed to hold by force, the settlers of the north secured by habit and endurance. To the north, sails once striped with fear now carried cargo instead of raiders. Merchant guilds in Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen forged bonds of trade that stretched from London to Novgorod. The Hanseatic League, a brotherhood of seafaring towns, replaced the pirate with the merchant. Their ships moved furs, salt, and cloth, where long ago they had borne warriors. They created a law of their own, written in Low German and ratified in counting houses instead of courts. Out of their covenants came something new. The idea that commerce could bind where conquest had divided. The institutions of the tribes, once rooted in clearing and campfire, found new life in this mercantile age. The Thing, the old assembly, where free men struck their shields to signal assent, endured as town council and regional parliament. Even kings deferred to its memory. Justice was still a public act. Disputes judged in daylight, verdicts proclaimed aloud. The Germanic habit of law, practical, spoken, communal, formed the skeleton of medieval government. In England, that tradition took on written permanence. The Norman conquerors brought their Latin scribes, but they found the island already rich in custom. The Anglo-Saxon Witan had given counsel to kings. Local courts had measured punishment by oath and fine. The Domesday Book, compiled under William the Conqueror, catalogued the realm with a precision unknown since Rome. Later kings, such as Henry II, would shape these customs into common law, blending Frankish precedent with Saxon practice. Beneath the polished Latin of royal charters lay the rhythm of the old thing, where truth was a matter of oath and reputation. In Germany, the Holy Roman Empire wove similar contradictions into unity. The emperors of the Ottonian and Salian houses claimed to rule in Caesar's name, yet their authority was unmistakably tribal. They were elected by princes, not anointed by lineage, and they ruled through vassalage rather than bureaucracy. The empire was less a nation than a constellation of loyalties. Bishops, dukes, and free cities bound to the emperor's person, as once clans had been bound to a warlord. Its legal pluralism, bewildering to later generations, was in truth the survival of the ancient Germanic instinct, to govern through consensus, not uniformity. Northward, the Scandinavian kingdoms settled into maturity. Denmark organized itself under a line of Christian monarchs descended from Note, its court still echoing with saga but ruled by scripture. Norway enshrined its faith in the cult of St. Olaf, the warrior king turned martyr whose shrine at Nidaros became the heart of national devotion. Sweden, slower to Christianize, carried its old gods longer, weaving them into folklore even as cathedrals rose over the lakes. In these lands, the old world and the new stood side by side. Stave churches carved with dragons, crosses set into stones once raised to Odin. Memory persisted in transformation. The warrior ethos that had shaped the tribes evolved into chivalry, the code of the knight. The oath to the warlord became the vow to one's lord and lady. The loyalty of the comitatus, once sealed in blood, turned to courtesy and service. The sword that had been an emblem of vengeance became a sign of justice. When knights rode beneath banners embroidered with saints, they carried with them the discipline of the shield wall, the ancient rhythm of loyalty and valor. The old laws, too, lived on in disguise. The principle of weregild, the price of a man's life, evolved into fines and compensations recorded in ledgers rather than pronounced before an oak. The custom of oath-swearing, once invoking Woden or Thor, now called upon the Holy Trinity. Even the structure of trial by peers, the right of judgment among equals, owed more to the clearings of the north than the forums of Rome. Language bore witness to this continuity. Old High German ripened into Middle High German. Old English matured into a new, supple tongue that absorbed Norman French, yet kept its Germanic bones. The poets of the courts and monasteries, whether composing the Nibelungenlied or the Song of Roland, still honored the same virtues. Bravery, faith, loyalty, and doom accepted without complaint. The cadences of the mead hall lingered beneath the rhyme of the cathedral. Faith itself changed shape without losing texture. The northern sense of destiny, wired, blended with Christian providence, turning fatalism into trust in divine order. Saints replaced heroes but inherited their courage. Martyrdom took the place of saga death. The churches of the 12th century, their arches reaching heavenward, were stone translations of the same yearning once expressed in song, the desire to stand firm against chaos and find meaning in struggle. In everyday life, remnants of the tribal world endured like roots beneath new soil. Village assemblies settled disputes as they had for centuries. Kinship still determined inheritance. Land was not owned, but held in trust. Even as monarchies and empires claimed divine sanction, the people clung to the older idea that authority was earned through counsel, generosity, and example. The free man's pride in self and community, once born in the shadow of forests, still shaped the temper of Europe. By the 12th century, the transformation was complete. The descendants of the so-called barbarians ruled the continent they had once overrun. The laws of the Franks, Saxons, and Goths had become the laws of kingdoms. Their speech filled courts and marketplaces. Their ethics defined knighthood and kingship. In their fusion with Christianity and the remnants of Rome, the Germanic tribes had forged the medieval world, a civilization disciplined by faith, bound by law, and haunted by memory. Yet traces of the old gods remained, lingering like incense after ritual. In folk tales, dwarfs still forged weapons beneath the hills. In harvest festivals, people still sang to the spirits of field and forest. The Christian Europe of cathedrals and universities carried within it the pagan Europe of runes and ravens, each incomplete without the other. The tribes had once lived by the sword, the sea, and the word of the thing. They ended as nations governed by parchment, canon, and conscience. But their legacy was more than survival. It was continuity. The same will that had resisted Rome's empire now sustained Christendom's diversity. From the forests of Jutland to the cloisters of Aachen, the voice of the North remained steady. Law before tyranny, honor before fear, freedom before silence. Their journey from wanderers to founders had remade the world, and if, in the hush of an evening mass, or the wind through northern pines, one listens closely, the echoes of that transformation can still be heard. The murmur of ancestors who refused to vanish, shaping in their endurance the very soul of Europe.